Lightning split the sky like a jagged wound, illuminating the torrential rain that hammered Maple Grove's pristine suburban streets. Through the chaos of Hurricane Miranda's fury, a neighbor's scream pierced the howling wind, not the scream of fear from flying debris, but something far more desperate, more human. Mrs. Thompson pressed her face against her kitchen window, raindrops distorting her view as she strained to locate the source of that haunting cry. There, behind the Hendersons' immaculate garden shed, shadows moved in the strobing lightning, and the screaming continued. Just 3 hours earlier, Rachel Martinez had been folding tiny onesies in her living room, her 8-month pregnant belly making even simple tasks feel monumental. The weather alerts had been escalating all day, transforming from routine storm warnings into urgent evacuation advisories. Her husband, Michael, a detective with the county police, had been called in for emergency duty, leaving her with strict instructions to stay with their neighbors if the storm intensified. "Promise me, you won't try to tough it out alone," he'd said, kissing her forehead before rushing out into the gathering wind. Rachel had promised, never imagining how that simple agreement would nearly cost her everything. When her power flickered and died at 7:30, Rachel grabbed her emergency bag and phone, locking her house before wading through the increasingly violent weather toward the Henderson property. The elderly couple had evacuated to their daughter's house inland, but they'd given Rachel their spare key months ago when they'd formed a neighborhood watch group. Their garden shed, reinforced and weatherproofed just last spring, seemed like the perfect temporary shelter until the worst passed. Rachel fumbled with the key in the growing darkness, finally managing to unlock the sturdy wooden door. Inside, the shed smelled of cedar and fertilizer, tools hanging neatly on pegboard walls while bags of mulch created a surprisingly comfortable makeshift seating area. Rachel settled herself carefully, one hand supporting her swollen belly while texting Michael her location. The baby had been particularly active all day, responding to her elevated stress with increasingly vigorous kicks that made her wince. She tried calling him, but the call went straight to voicemail. Emergency services were probably overwhelmed. She left a message anyway. "Honey, I'm in the Hendersons' shed, safe and dry. Love you." That's when she heard footsteps splashing through the floodwater outside, accompanied by the distinctive beam of a high-powered flashlight. Rachel felt relief wash over her. Maybe Michael had managed to check on her after all. She moved toward the door, ready to unlock it and greet him with grateful arms. But the voice that cut through the storm wasn't her husband's familiar baritone. "What the hell do you think you're doing in there?" The voice belonged to Karen Whitmore, the neighborhood's self-appointed HOA enforcer, though their community didn't actually have a formal homeowners association. Karen had been pushing for months to establish one, citing property values and community standards with the fervor of a religious convert. Rachel had politely declined to sign her petition, along with most of their neighbors. Rachel opened the door a crack, rain immediately lashing her face. "Karen, thank God you're okay. The storm got so bad. I needed somewhere safe to wait it out." Karen's weatherproof jacket and rain hat made her look like some kind of severe military officer as she stood in the flooding yard. Flashlight trained directly on Rachel's face. "This is private property. You don't belong here. The Hendersons said I could use their shed in emergencies. I have their key." Rachel held up the spare key ring, confusion evident in her voice. "Karen, I'm 8 months pregnant. My house lost power. I just need to stay dry until this passes." Karen's expression, illuminated stroboscopically by lightning, twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. "I don't care what they told you. Outsiders don't belong in our neighborhood, especially not squatting in other people's property without proper authorization." "Outsiders." Rachel's voice rose above the wind. I've lived here for 3 years. You helped me plant my flower garden last spring. But Karen was already moving, her bulk surging forward with surprising speed. Before Rachel could react, Karen's weathered hands slammed the shed door shut with brutal force. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoed like a gunshot, followed immediately by something metallic, a chain. Rachel realized with growing horror being wound around the external handle. Karen, what are you doing? Rachel pounded on the door, panic creeping into her voice. Let me out. This isn't funny. You'll stay put until proper authorities can deal with this situation. Karen's voice carried through the wooden walls, distorted by wind and rain. I'm calling the police about trespassing and breaking and entering. Rachel threw her entire weight against the door, but the reinforced frame didn't budge. The chain rattled mockingly on the other side. Karen, please, I'm pregnant. I could go into labor. The only response was the sound of footsteps splashing away through the storm, leaving Rachel trapped in the wooden tomb that had moments before felt like salvation. The first hour passed in waves of disbelief and mounting claustrophobia. Rachel tried calling Michael repeatedly, but her phone showed no signal. The cell towers must have been damaged by the storm. She explored every inch of the shed, searching for another way out. But the Hendersons had built it like a fortress. The single window was too small for her pregnant body, even if she could have broken the reinforced glass. Tools hung tantalizingly on the walls, but the pegboard was bolted securely, and her pregnancy made it impossible to generate enough leverage to pry anything loose. As the second hour began, the first contraction hit like a fist, closing around her entire torso. Rachel doubled over, gasping. One hand braced against the workbench, while the other clutched her belly. The baby was responding to her stress hormones, her elevated heart rate, the sheer terror of their situation. When the contraction finally released its grip, Rachel found herself sobbing not just from pain, but from the realization that she might give birth in this confined space, alone, with no medical help. "Help!" she screamed, pounding on the walls with renewed desperation. "Somebody help me! I'm trapped! I'm pregnant!" The storm swallowed her cries, wind howling like a living thing around the shed's frame. Rain drummed against the roof with increasing violence, and she could hear debris striking the wall's tree branches. Loose shingles, things the hurricane had torn free and hurled through the darkness. Each impact made the shed shudder, reminding her how vulnerable she was, how completely at the storm's mercy. By the third hour, dehydration was setting in. The emergency bottle of water in her bag was nearly empty, rationed sip by careful sip. But her pregnant body needed far more fluids than she'd anticipated. The contractions weren't regular yet, false labor brought on by stress. She hoped, but they were getting stronger. Each one left her breathless and shaking, clutching the workbench for support, while her vision blurred at the edges. That's when she heard voices outside, muffled by the storm, but definitely human. Rachel summoned every ounce of strength she had left and began pounding on the door with both fists, screaming until her throat felt raw. "Help! I'm in here! Please help me!" The voices got closer, and she recognized Mrs. Thompson's distinctive warble. "I swear I heard screaming coming from over here." In this storm, you sure it wasn't just the wind? That was Bob Chen from 2 doors down. "Help!" Rachel screamed again, throwing her shoulder against the door. "I'm trapped in the shed. Please!" Suddenly, the voices were right outside, and she could hear hands testing the door handle, rattling the chain that held her prisoner. "Oh my God! There's someone in there!" Mrs. Thompson's voice carried easily through the wooden walls. The doors chained shut. "Get bolt cutters!" Bob shouted over the wind. "I'll get mine from the garage." Rachel sank to her knees in relief, tears streaming down her face. But before Bob could return, another voice joined the group, outside a voice that made Rachel's blood freeze in her veins. "Step away from that shed immediately." Karen's authoritative tone cut through the storm like a blade. "I've secured a trespasser inside pending police arrival." "Karen, have you lost your damn mind?" Mrs. Thompson's voice shook with indignation. "That's Rachel Martinez in there. She's 8 months pregnant. She was illegally occupying private property." Karen replied with cold certainty. "The Hendersons didn't authorize her access. I'm protecting their interests." "The Hendersons are at their daughter's house." Bob's voice had returned, slightly breathless. "Rachel's part of our neighborhood watch. She has their permission." Through the wooden walls, Rachel could hear the argument escalating, voices rising above the storm's fury. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to follow the conversation that would determine her fate. "I don't care what arrangements they think they made." Karen's voice had taken on the rigid tone of someone who refuses to admit error. Proper protocols weren't followed. Insurance liability wasn't considered. What if she damages their property? What if she gives birth in there and creates a biohazard situation? Jesus Christ. Karen. Bob sounded like he was fighting to control his temper. "She's not a biohazard. She's our neighbor, and she's in medical distress." Another contraction chose that moment to seize Rachel's body, more intense than any before. She couldn't help the anguished cry that tore from her throat, a sound that carried clearly through the walls to the group outside. The argument stopped abruptly. "That's it," Mrs. Thompson declared. "I'm calling 911. "The phone lines are down," Karen said quickly. "Cell towers, too. I already tried calling the police about the trespassing situation." Rachel fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, hoping desperately that Karen was wrong. Still no signal. But something else caught her attention, a notification from her location services app, the one that shared her GPS coordinates with Michael's phone. It had been trying to update her location for the past hour, storing the data locally until it could connect to the network. If the cell towers came back online, even briefly, the app would send her exact coordinates to her husband automatically. The argument outside continued, but Rachel tuned it out, focusing instead on conserving her strength. The contractions were definitely getting closer together, maybe 20 minutes apart now. Not active labor yet, but heading in that direction. She needed to stay calm, needed to think clearly. Michael was a detective. He had resources, connections, ways of finding people that ordinary civilians didn't. If anyone could track her down, it was him. But would he think to look for her here? She'd told him she was going to the neighbors, but their street had dozens of houses. Without her location app updating, he'd have to check each one individually, and in this storm, that could take hours she didn't have. A new voice outside made her heart leap with hope. Mr. Patterson from the end of the street, who worked as an EMT. What the hell is going on out here? "James, thank God you're here." Mrs. Thompson's relief was audible. "Rachel Martinez is trapped in this shed. She's having contractions. And this woman," the disgust in her voice was unmistakable, "has chained the door shut." "Are you insane?" Patterson's professional training took over immediately. "Ma'am, step aside. I need to assess the patient." Rachel heard movement outside, then Patterson's voice, closer to the door. "Rachel, can you hear me? This is James Patterson, EMT with the county. How are you feeling?" "James." Rachel pressed herself against the door, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I'm having contractions about 20 minutes apart. I'm dehydrated. The baby's moving a lot. I think the stress is affecting him. Him, even through the crisis. Patterson's voice carried a note of warmth. You know the gender. We're naming him David. Rachel managed between rapid breaths. After Michael's father. That's a strong name. David's going to be just fine. Okay, we're going to get you out of there. Bob, you said you had bolt cutters. Right here, Bob's voice confirmed. But Karen wasn't finished. You people are making a terrible mistake. This woman broke into private property during a state of emergency. What you're doing is obstruction of justice. Lady, what I'm doing is preventing a woman from giving birth in a tool shed during a hurricane. Patterson's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in medical emergencies. Now back off, or I'll have you arrested for interfering with emergency medical care. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air as Bob went to work on the chain with his bolt cutters. Rachel held her breath, praying that the links would give way, that this nightmare would finally end. But after several minutes of effort, Bob's frustrated voice carried through the storm. The chain's too thick. These cutters aren't strong enough. Rachel's heart sank. She slumped against the door, another contraction building in her lower back like a tide of fire. This one was stronger than the others, forcing her to her hands and knees on the shed's plywood floor. She couldn't suppress the moan of pain that escaped her lips. Rachel, talk to me. Patterson's voice was urgent now. How far apart are the contractions? Maybe 15 minutes. She gasped as the pain crested and began to ebb. They're getting stronger. Okay, listen to me. I need you to try to stay calm. Stress can accelerate labor, and we don't want that right now. Can you do some breathing exercises for me? Over the next 30 minutes, Patterson coached her through controlled breathing, while the others worked frantically to find a way into the shed. Mrs. Thompson had gone home to find a crowbar. Bob was examining the hinges to see if they could be removed from outside. Even Karen had grown quiet, perhaps finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. That's when they heard it, a car engine cutting through the storm's noise, approaching fast and skidding to a stop in the flooded street. Car doors slammed, and Rachel's heart leaped as she recognized the voice shouting over the wind. Where is she? Where's my wife? Michael. Rachel began sobbing with relief, pounding on the door with renewed strength. Michael, I'm in here. I'm in the shed. Heavy footsteps splashed through the standing water, and suddenly her husband's voice was right outside the door, closer and more solid than anything she'd heard in hours. Rachel, baby, are you okay? The door's chained shut, she called back. I've been trapped for hours. I'm having contractions. What happened next unfolded with the swift efficiency of law enforcement training. Michael's voice, when he spoke to the group, carried a deadly calm that Rachel had only heard him use when dealing with dangerous criminals. Who did this? The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Mrs. Thompson's voice, shaky but determined, broke the tension. Karen Whitmore chained your wife inside. She said Rachel was trespassing. Ma'am, you're under arrest for unlawful imprisonment, reckless endangerment, and interfering with emergency medical care. Michael's voice had shifted into full cop mode, professional and implacable. You have the right to remain silent. This is ridiculous. Karen's voice finally broke, all her earlier authority crumbling into defensive hysteria. I was protecting private property. She didn't belong there. She's 8 months pregnant, and you locked her in a shed during a hurricane. Michael's voice could have cut glass. Save your explanations for your lawyer. Rachel heard the distinctive sound of handcuffs clicking closed, followed by radio chatter as Michael called for backup and an ambulance. But even as he coordinated the official response, his voice never left her for long. "Hold on, sweetheart. I've got heavy-duty cutters in the patrol car. We'll have you out in 2 minutes." True to his word, the chain parted with a sharp crack less than 2 minutes later. The shed door swung open, and Rachel looked up through tears to see her husband's familiar face, his dark eyes wide with concern and relief. Behind him, the storm still raged, but surrounded by the warm glow of flashlights held by their neighbors. It seemed far less threatening than it had from inside her wooden prison. Michael dropped to his knees beside her, his hands immediately going to her face, checking her pupils, feeling for fever. "How are you feeling? When did the contractions start?" "A few hours ago." Rachel leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his solid presence. "They were getting closer together, but I think they've slowed down now that you're here." Patterson appeared in the doorway, medical bag in hand. "Detective Martinez James Patterson, EMT. I've been monitoring your wife's condition. We need to get her to the hospital for evaluation, but her vital signs seem stable." As Michael helped her to her feet, Rachel caught sight of Karen being led away to a police car, her imperious demeanor completely shattered. The woman who had seemed so powerful, so certain of her authority just hours before, now looked small and pathetic in handcuffs, her rain-soaked hair plastered to her skull. "I don't understand," Karen was saying to the officer escorting her. "I was just trying to maintain community standards. Property values are important. Someone has to take responsibility." Michael's jaw tightened as he helped Rachel toward his patrol car. "You took responsibility. All right. For endangering a pregnant woman and her unborn child. That's felony charges in this state." The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of blue lights and radio chatter. The hurricane was beginning to weaken, but emergency crews were still dealing with widespread damage throughout the county. Rachel found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought her to this moment, how a simple storm shelter had become a trap, how her neighbor's kindness had battled against one person's rigid interpretation of rules and property rights. At the hospital, Dr. Sarah Kim examined Rachel thoroughly while Michael paced the emergency room, still in his rain-soaked uniform. The contractions had stopped completely, suggesting they had indeed been stress-induced rather than true labor. Baby David's heartbeat was strong and regular, showing no signs of distress despite the traumatic evening. "You were incredibly lucky," Dr. Kim told them both as she reviewed the monitor readings. Stress-induced contractions can sometimes trigger premature labor, especially this late in pregnancy. The fact that they stopped once you were safe suggests that your body was responding to the psychological trauma rather than any physical complications. Rachel squeezed Michael's hand, finally allowing herself to believe that both she and the baby were truly going to be okay. "What happens now? To Karen? I mean..." Michael's expression grew serious. "She's being held on multiple charges. Unlawful imprisonment is a felony, especially when it endangers someone's life. The district attorney will probably add reckless endangerment, interfering with emergency medical care, and possibly assault charges, depending on how the investigation unfolds." "Will she go to prison?" "If convicted on all counts, she's looking at 5 to 10 years. Minimum. More if the prosecutor can demonstrate that she understood the medical risks and acted anyway." Michael's voice softened as he brushed a strand of hair from Rachel's face. "But that's not your concern right now. Your job is to focus on staying healthy and bringing our son into the world safely." Over the following days, as Hurricane Miranda's aftermath was cleaned up and power restored throughout their neighborhood. The story of Rachel's ordeal spread quickly through their community. The local news picked it up, then regional outlets, and finally, national media. The narrative that emerged was one that resonated far beyond their small suburb: a pregnant woman trapped by a neighbor's petty authoritarianism, saved by community cooperation and law enforcement. Karen's arrest photo became a viral meme, her rain-soaked, defeated expression serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and rigid rule-following without human compassion. Legal experts interviewed on television discussed the case as an example of how homeowners association disputes could escalate into criminal behavior when residents took enforcement into their own hands. But for Rachel and Michael, the most meaningful response came from their immediate neighbors. Mrs. Thompson organized a meal train that provided fresh dinners for weeks. Bob Chen installed motion sensor lights around their property and checked on them daily. James Patterson stopped by regularly to monitor Rachel's blood pressure and answer questions about the final weeks of her pregnancy. Even the Hendersons, when they returned from their daughter's house, were horrified to learn what had happened in their absence. They formally pressed charges against Karen for trespassing on their property and violating Rachel's permission to use their shed. They also donated money to the County Emergency Services Fund in Rachel's name, citing the heroic response of the EMT and police officers who had worked to free her. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Karen's lawyer attempted to negotiate a plea deal, arguing that her client had acted out of misguided community concern rather than malicious intent. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Foster, refused to consider anything less than significant jail time. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, Foster explained to reporters outside the courthouse. The defendant had multiple opportunities to recognize her error and correct it. She chose instead to double down on her position, even when told that she was endangering a pregnant woman's life. That demonstrates a pattern of reckless disregard for human safety that demands serious consequences. During the trial, which began just 2 weeks before Rachel's due date, witness after witness testified to Karen's escalating behavior over the previous months. Neighbors described how she had appointed herself as an unofficial enforcer of property standards, citing violations for everything from lawn height to holiday decorations left up too long. The Hendersons testified that they had never asked Karen to monitor their property and had explicitly told multiple neighbors, including Rachel, that they were welcome to use the shed in emergencies. The most damaging testimony came from James Patterson, who described finding Rachel in active distress, while Karen continued to insist that protocols needed to be followed. "I've been an EMT for 15 years, he told the jury. "I've never encountered someone who prioritized property rights over a medical emergency involving a pregnant woman. The defendant's actions showed a callous disregard for human life that I found genuinely shocking." Karen took the stand in her own defense, trying to portray herself as a victim of neighborhood politics and media sensationalism. She claimed that she had genuinely believed Rachel was an intruder, that she had planned to call for help as soon as the storm passed, that she had never intended for anyone to be hurt. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. The prosecutor demonstrated that Karen had known Rachel personally for years, had helped her with gardening projects, had seen her pregnant belly growing over the previous months. Phone records showed that Karen had not attempted to call emergency services at any point during the evening, despite claiming that the phone lines were down, a claim that was easily disproven by testimony from other residents who had successfully made calls throughout the storm. Most damning of all was Karen's behavior after help arrived. Multiple witnesses testified that she had continued to argue that Rachel should remain locked in the shed even after learning about the contractions, even after a trained EMT had explained the medical risks. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Karen received a sentence of 7 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years pending good behavior and completion of court-ordered psychological counseling. Rachel gave birth to David Michael Martinez exactly 1 week after the trial concluded, in the bright, sterile safety of the hospital's maternity ward. Michael was at her side throughout the delivery, as were both sets of grandparents and several of their neighbors who had become like family during the ordeal. When David finally arrived, healthy, perfect, and loudly announcing his presence to the world, Rachel found herself thinking about the night in the shed. How close they had come to a very different outcome. The neighborhood had changed in the months following the incident. The experience had brought the community closer together, but it had also sparked important conversations about property rights, emergency protocols, and the dangers of unaccountable authority. At Mrs. Thompson's suggestion, they formed an actual neighborhood watch group, not the informal arrangement they'd had before, but a structured organization with clear guidelines, elected leadership, and established procedures for emergency situations. They also worked with the county to establish emergency shelter protocols for severe weather events. New legislation required that any community with more than 50 homes develop evacuation and shelter plans, including designated safe buildings and trained volunteers to coordinate emergency response. Rachel was invited to testify before the county commission about her experience, helping to shape policies that would protect other residents in future storms. Karen's house, meanwhile, stood empty and slowly deteriorating. The bank foreclosed after she fell behind on mortgage payments from prison, and the property became a stark reminder of how quickly a life could unravel when fear and rigid thinking replaced compassion and common sense. Neighbors reported that the garden she had once obsessively maintained was now overgrown with weeds. The lawn, patchy and brown. The very property standards she had claimed to protect, violated by her own abandoned home. On David's first birthday, Rachel and Michael hosted a neighborhood barbecue in their backyard. As she watched their son taking his first tentative steps across the grass, surrounded by the people who had fought to save both their lives, Rachel reflected on the strange lessons the past year had taught her. She had learned that safety could become a trap, that rules without wisdom could become weapons, that community was not about property values or perfect lawns, but about people caring for each other when it mattered most. Mrs. Thompson approached with a piece of birthday cake, settling into a lawn chair beside Rachel as they watched the children play. "Hard to believe it's been a year," the older woman said quietly. Rachel nodded, adjusting David's sun hat as he crawled toward his father. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it seems like a lifetime ago." "You know what I think about sometimes, Mrs." Thompson's voice grew thoughtful. "How many Karen Whitmores are out there in other neighborhoods, other communities, people who think they're protecting something important, but they've lost sight of what really matters." It was a sobering thought, but also a hopeful one. Their story had been covered by national media, had sparked conversations about community responsibility and individual rights, had influenced legislation and emergency planning across multiple states. If even a few other communities had learned from their experience, if even a few other pregnant women would be safer during the next storm because of the policies their ordeal had inspired, then perhaps some good had come from that terrible night. As the sun set over Maple Grove, casting long shadows across the well-maintained lawns and carefully tended gardens, Rachel held her son close and watched her neighbors cleaning up the remnants of the party. These people flawed, complicated, sometimes difficult people had fought for her when it mattered. They had chosen compassion over convenience, humanity over property values, community over conformity. In the distance, Thunder rumbled across the evening sky, and Rachel felt a familiar tightness in her chest. But this time, as the first drops of rain began to fall, she was surrounded by love and safety, held by the knowledge that she would never again face a storm alone. The shed behind the Henderson house still stood, but it was just a building now, a simple structure of wood and nails, rather than a symbol of powerlessness and fear. David gurgled happily in her arms as they headed inside, and Rachel smiled at the voice of new life, of hope, of a future built on the foundation of a community that had chosen, when tested, to do the right thing. Sometimes that was enough to change everything.